Okay, we are going to move now to our final panel on the conference, which will focus on the issue of carbon dioxide storage. A lot of times when we focus on carbon dioxide removal, in my mind, we focus on the aspect of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is obviously extremely important. But the other end of this equation are for some of our approaches, especially things such as BECCS and direct air capture, for example, is the issue of storage, right? Utilization of carbon dioxide is obviously being discussed. It will have a role, but in my opinion and the opinion of many others, at least in the short term, the lion's share of CO2 that's removed from the atmosphere is necessarily going to have to be sequestered terrestrially or in the world's oceans, and that raises all kinds of questions, right, associated with permanence and liability, transportation issues, ownership issues, and so forth. And the United States and individual states are grappling with those issues, and there's quite frankly a fire hose of discussion. Right, recently the North Dakota Supreme Court opining on pore space ownership, for example, and so thought it would be important to wrap up and discuss some of these legal issues with a panel with a rich vein of expertise in this context. So our last panel is entitled Review of the Diversity of State Policies and Regulations of CO2 Storage, with a focus on the United States. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Mike Moore, who serves as the program director for the United States Energy Agency. And before I turn it over to Mike, I want to say in a little bit I have to run off to teach. And so this is the last time I will see you virtually this year. I'd like to thank all of you once again for attending the conference, and Simon Nicholson, who's my former co-director at the Institute for Carbon Removal, Law and Policy, will take us out at the end. So thank you again for everyone attending. And now I'll turn it over to Mike.
Well, thank you very much. And to Northwestern University and the group to have this session and have me be a moderator. The program we've got in front of us is built on the back of two studies that USEA had put out to the market. And one was picked up by the University of Wyoming and the University of West Virginia, and the other one picked up by Cadmus, and it deals with all this issues with the legal and issues around surface, pore space, right-of-ways, mineral rights, etc. And I'm not going to go into the details, but we'll say I'm very honored to have the time to be the moderator for the four folks that are on with us right now, all leaders in their field in this space. And we were a little bit ahead of the curve. It's a very hot topic, because I'm sure you're hearing in the previous sessions, and you can see in the news if you're following what's going on CCS and land rights. I am going to not talk a lot and back off. We have Jennifer Brown is going to be running I believe the time blocks for us. So if you have anything you need to do with me, let me know. I think on the order of the programs, we'll get going with Tara. I believe you're going to start first with your group, you and Jesse. Again, very honored to be with you all. You know this space extremely well. You're in states that have these issues, but are front and center right now being sorted out. And I have to think that as a result of the two studies that have been done, that there's been some use of the data inside the studies for several states to advance or modify or rework some of their codes on this. So with that, Tara, it's all yours.
All right, and are you guys able to put the slides up, or can I share? Sorry. Sorry about that. Let me try to find that. I thought that you'd already have the slides. Okay. Okay, hopefully you guys can all see and hear me. And thank you again for the opportunity to present. And I particularly appreciate that we're able to do this remotely and virtually and all be together while limiting our carbon impact. So thank you for that option and your intentionality around that. Like Mike said, we have a huge kind of land coordination issue ahead of us, both in terms of pipelines and in terms of subsurface storage resources. And a lot of that, in fact, most of it is going to be dependent upon state law. And so that was the genesis for this particular project. This is from the Net Zero America program that shows kind of our current identified storage locations, which are here in the gray. There are others in addition to these in our existing pipeline network. And you can see where it's envisioned we would be by 2050 and the massive scale of expansion that's going to be needed to accomplish this. Why this is particularly interesting from a state law perspective is that most of the non-class 6 aspects of subsurface storage are actually matters of state law, and siting CO2 pipelines are also currently controlled by state law. And so as part of that, we engaged in a study, which was then continued by Cadmus Group, where we had an overview of both state and federal issues, including federal lands and different state policies, looking at 12 different states and looking at different trends about where state laws differed and where this creates tensions and potential conflicts that could be a barrier to large hubs or interstate projects. So I worked on this project together with my colleague Chris Koski, and with Professor Richardson and Dr. Taylor at West Virginia University. I think the most interesting findings that we had were that while some things are under state law and are very unique, for example, pore space ownership, as it's determined under state law, the fact that states may have different programs for pore space ownership doesn't per se create large coordination issues to use of geologic storage at scale. But there are other issues related to plume migration, subsurface trespass, related to unitization and infrastructure development, which really do require, and particularly in liability transfer, they require a homogeneous framework across state boundaries. And so finding those places were some of the areas that we tried to focus. One of the main takeaways we had was how critical it will be, particularly in the West, to figure out issues related to use of federal pore space. So if you look at this map here, you can see that most projects in the West, particularly if you're in Wyoming or Nevada, are going to include an aspect of federal pore space because there's so much federal land ownership. Even where you don't have federal minerals, you would have federal pore space as part of that fee interest. And that would require obtaining subsurface easements or right-of-ways to be able to inject into the federal land, as well as surface right-of-ways for infrastructure like well pads and pipelines. You can also see here that BLM this year issued an instructional memorandum as to its processes to grant subsurface interests associated with geologic carbon storage. And that in the last month, they issued the first right-of-way for rights that are associated with a carbon storage project. That was an approval for an EIS documents that approved basically an 8-inch pipeline to move CO2, as well as a surface well pad for an injection well, but it did not actually grant subsurface rights. The issues of federal land are varied depending on the various land management agencies. For example, Forest Service land has a host of issues that are different than land managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and land that's managed by Department of Defense has its own series of issues. So figuring out these and coordinating them will require working with a lot of different agencies, understanding their enabling acts and regulations and procedures. And even if you have clear state law, which is developing, but which many states don't have, because federal land would, or federal law would preempt much of that state law, it may not clearly or necessarily apply to all aspects of a project that has both private, state-owned, and federal lands. If you look at pore space ownership, you also see some difference in approach. I would say most states at this point have come around to the idea that pore space is part of the surface estate, where you have a split estate. How they get there is different. In, for example, North Dakota and Wyoming, pore space is vested in the surface owner by statute. But as you'll see in several other states, it has been vested in the surface owner by case law. But in the vast majority of states within the United States, there's no case law that specifically addresses this issue. So figuring out who you need to obtain those rights from requires taking a look at other cases related to oil and gas, cases related to groundwater, and trying to reach a conclusion about who has those pore space rights. I think the clear trend is towards the surface owner. And I also think this is an area that's a very low-hanging fruit for states who want to encourage geologic storage operations within their territorial boundaries, because clarifying pore space ownership by statute is well established. How to do that, if there isn't case law, it's a way to reduce uncertainty. Then even where you have clarity about pore space ownership, the relationship to the mineral estate varies as well depending on state law. Again, because regulation of property is a matter of state law. This isn't an area where we have a lot of clear federal overlays. So states have different statutes that apply to use of surface in split estates. There's varying approaches to surface mineral disputes, and the common law as it's developed in these states creates differing obligations related to how you resolve those conflicts, to what kind of accommodation, if any, may be necessary. And while these are very important for use of a specific piece of land, they're not necessarily huge issues for regional coordination, because if you have a project that spans, that's an interstate project, you would just follow the different law as it's developed within those two different states. I think, though, overall, the scale of these projects, like we're going to have like gigaton storage projects, right? We are going to need to coordinate tremendous amounts of land access. That's land access for your area of review under the Class 6 program. It's land access for corrective actions. It's land access for monitoring wells. It's control of the subsurface storage complex. And doing this at the scale with potentially thousands of landowners and very quickly evolving legal frameworks presents a lot of cost and uncertainty. That's probably the biggest barrier to getting a lot of these projects done. And exactly what scope of land rights are needed is still developing as well, right? We're still learning how much pore space you have to be able to demonstrate control. And that may differ whether you want to claim credits under the CCS protocol for California's LCFS standard, or whether, depending on the standards that the emitter is requiring in your offtake agreement. So, and what credits they want to claim within carbon markets. So A lot of moving pieces here. And some states have put in place unitization, much like we have for oil and gas, which permits combination of pore space for geologic storage. And if you get a minimum threshold, which varies between 60 and 80%, it permits sort of a compulsory unitization process to allow a project to go forward, and gives oversight of that to a conservation agency to protect the different rights of pore space owners within that. That doesn't solve all your problems. The state frameworks don't allow pooling, so you still may need to obtain surface use rights, which after unitizing the pore space might be difficult to obtain. It doesn't necessarily preclude cases for subsurface trespass in all cases, although it may create an administrative remedy, which would have to be exhausted first. And then there's continuing uncertainty about this, because as even within these unitization frameworks, some things are unclear about exactly where you draw the boundaries, which pore space is affected, who must be included in the unit and who doesn't. And then because these unitization frameworks are developed under state law, they wouldn't exceed across state jurisdictional boundaries. So for example, a project that has aspects that are in both North Dakota and Montana, the unitization framework in North Dakota would not apply and allow combination of pore space and subsurface interests in Montana. And so that's another area that I see a need for federal action, is to allow federal unitization of these interstate projects, because in theory, you have different pore space ownership laws, different mineral accommodation laws, different statutes, or sometimes one state has a statute and the other doesn't for unitization. Maybe one state has primacy over their Class 6 program and the other is being administered by EPA. And so being able to coordinate efficiently across state boundaries, I think, is going to be a critical issue for having storage at scale. Okay, with this, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse. So I think he needs to take over the screen share so you don't lose the slides when I stop being the speaker.
Okay, thank you, Tara. And I will attempt to share my screen here. And so I'm going to talk about some local regulation of geologic storage activities, talk about eminent domain, use an example of Pennsylvania to apply some of our findings, and then wrap up with some of our conclusions from our study. Local regulation of geologic storage activities is not something that was part of our study. It's something that we just started thinking about, and we were requested to address it a little bit here today. Actually, I don't think anybody has addressed it much at all. So Tara and I talked about it, bounced some ideas off, and it's very intriguing. While states generally preempt much of local action on oil and gas, with respect to carbon storage, number one, many states don't have any state regulation. And number two, the states that do have regulations, like I'm happy to say that my home state of West Virginia just adopted some pore space regulations and a framework for carbon. Those frameworks are generally not as exhaustive as the oil and gas. So even where your state has passed some carbon storage frameworks, there's probably some room for local government action. We have to start with the 10th Amendment to the United States, which basically makes the states the default holders of power in our federalist system of governance. For local governments to have any power, it basically has to be delegated to them by the states. And so you have to look at your enabling authority in every state to see exactly what you have. But I think it comes down to basically the zoning authority. And when I was looking at this, I said clearly your zoning can look at surface activity. It can look at surface impacts of the subsurface activity and activity on the surface of the storage. So for example, a local government might say no residential housing units may be placed above carbon storage or something to that effect. A bigger question is what local governments could do to the subsurface activity. And we've already got the UIC regulations. And so to the extent that your Class 6 wells are regulated at the federal level to protect water quality, I think those types of regulation at the local level would be preempted. What else you could do is not really clear. But Tara and I actually got kind of excited talking about this because we thought that in states with no regulation or limited regulation at the state level, there seems to be a lot of room for local governments to use perhaps their eminent domain authority combined with their zoning authority to really promote carbon storage. And I know in my part of the country, local governments are excited about promoting this. So I think there are some opportunities. There needs to be more research on this. Local governments could do setbacks, minimum lot sizes, spacing. They could address through performance standards impacts like light, noise, dust, and odors. But through that eminent domain authority, they would have ownership and perhaps be able to do a lot. Now, of course, with pipelines, they're difficult to build, period, today. But local governments wouldn't be able to do much on transportation, at least outside of the county or the area. But as far as storage, we think there are some opportunities. Now, we looked at the eminent domain regulations for each of the states. And what we found was that most of the states had eminent domain authority for pipeline operations, but they were mostly pretty old, so they didn't address CO2. And there's a lot of inconsistencies in the state regulations with respect to whether the user of the eminent domain authority had to be a common carrier. So that's inconsistent. And so I'm repeating some of what Tara said. You're going to hear inconsistent a lot here and uncertainty. But because of that inconsistency, and the inconsistency between oil and gas and CO2, that can pose even more challenges on top of the challenges that already exist for pipelines. In addition, many of you, most of you have probably heard of the Kelo decision where the United States Supreme Court said that the government in that case could use eminent domain for economic development purposes. In response to Kelo, a lot of states, either through constitutional amendments, but mostly through enabling authority, have passed what I call anti-Kelo statutes, which prevent the use of eminent domain in economic development or for private purposes or things of that nature. As is usually the case, those types of laws can have unintended consequences. And in those states that have anti-kilo statutes, it may prevent the use of eminent domain for CO2 purposes or for any private economic development. The final point on eminent domain is that most of the states did allow you to condemn subsurface for some purposes, but again, these were mostly older statutes, so they didn't address CO2. So there's some uncertainty there as well. What can you do for carbon removal if there's no state law? We have no statutory regime for CO2 sequestration, which is the case in most of our states. No existing CO2 distribution network. Only public utility corporations are given eminent domain authority. We have uncertain pore space ownership. And this is in Pennsylvania. I'm sorry, backing up a little bit. Pennsylvania is kind of typical of most of the states. In a lot of respects, it has some unique aspects as well. So for these first bullet points that I've gone through, Pennsylvania is typical of other states that they don't have this. CO2 is treated as a pollutant for the most part in Pennsylvania, although it's not really clear. The EPA administers the UIC programs for all classes of wells in Pennsylvania. Now we get to some unique challenges in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has an environmental rights amendment, and since the Robinson case, which was pretty broadly recognized, a lot of states are now attempting to pass environmental rights amendment. That amendment basically says that the citizens of Pennsylvania have the right to a healthy environment. In the Robinson case, the state legislature had passed a statute that basically required all local governments in Pennsylvania to allow oil and gas operations anywhere within the municipality or the county, but the regulation had to adhere to state guidelines. So it wasn't anything goes. It was the state said, here are the guidelines. We're going to provide the guidelines, and local governments, you don't have any control. Well, that statute was challenged under the Environmental Rights Amendment, and the court there held that the state could not dictate how local governments allowed oil and gas everywhere, and that the local governments retain the zoning authority for this. So in that regard, it gives local governments in Pennsylvania the authority to perhaps encourage that development if they want to. It also allows local governments, if they don't want CO2 storage, to perhaps create roadblocks through zoning. So that is a little different. Now, the last thing that is slightly different in Pennsylvania is a member of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And for those of you who are not familiar, that's a Northeast coalition of states that have pledged allegiance to a certain type of regulatory regime, a cap on carbon from power generation. And it's a very aggressive approach to getting us to carbon zero, at least from power generation. In my opinion, that is somewhat of a roadblock to carbon storage. It's an aggressive schedule to eliminate carbon totally, at least from one sector. I think it creates some uncertainty. Private investors are probably looking at a shorter timeline. So it raises some questions. I will note that the regulations to implement the regional greenhouse gas initiative guidelines, they were challenged. There is a preliminary injunction against them. We basically have the Democratic governor who wants to be a member pitted against the state legislature who does not want to be a member, and they're fighting that out. In the meantime, Pennsylvania has considered a CO2 framework. There is a bill. It has not been introduced yet. I was told this week that Pennsylvania might seek to be able to apply state regulations for Class 6 wells to get primacy for Class 6 prior to adopting their carbon framework for the state. So finally, I'll close up by saying, here's what we found as a conclusion. The cost, risk, and coordination challenges trying to make things consistent between states based on these different or non-existent regulatory frameworks is going to be a challenge. Most states still do not have any state regulatory framework. So again, maybe local governments can step in, or as Tara said, it's a great opportunity for states to come in. And that's the next bullet point. This is a significant opportunity for state lawmakers. And we in West Virginia have taken that opportunity and created a framework which will help the state be better able to participate in this. Jurisdictional limitations are going to pose more challenges. And that's in particular, as Tara talked about, with federal lands, a lot of uncertainty. The federal government has indicated that they recognize this issue and they are willing to try to make things easier. That is very promising. There is a federal bill that has not moved yet. We'll see what happens after the midterm elections. And again, the federal government might have an important role to play here in stepping in and providing a backstop, providing something that will allow some consistency in these interstate projects and allow interstate projects to move forward more easily. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Mike, or maybe to our other research team that did some research in some other states. And I'll look forward to questions at the end.
Jesse, thank you very much. Yeah, we will do the questions in group at the end. And Sherry, are you up and ready to run with yours? Sherry Ring with Cadmus, and they had a similar study that they had done on the states as well. In both cases, different insights and views created a lot of useful insights for folks that have been using the studies as guidelines to what to do with their work. With that, Sherry.
Thanks, Mike. Actually, Marie's doing the honors.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me? I had a brief blip with my microphone.
Yes.
Hear you now.
Great. All right, and more importantly, can everyone see my screen? All right, great. Is it a PowerPoint? Okay, great. Hi, so good morning, everyone. My name is Marie Lewis, and I'm a research analyst who will be presenting today on behalf of the Cadmus Group. I'm joined here today with my technical director, Sherry Ring, who will be here to answer questions after the presentation. So I will be presenting today on a state comparison of technical and policy issues for carbon capture, unitization, and sequestration. Our report is a follow-on to a report by WVU and the University of Wyoming that evaluated states in the Midwest and Appalachia and also provided an overview of the federal regulatory landscape. We will be focusing today on comparing technical and policy issues for CCUS from a geological perspective. So without further ado, let's get started. So a little bit of a CCUS background. Carbon capture, unitization, and sequestration, or CCUS, encompasses a suite of technologies that involve capturing carbon dioxide from emission sources or directly from the atmosphere, and then compressing, transporting, and injecting it deep into subsurface formations for storage. CCUS has a critical role to play in decarbonizing the global economy and achieving climate change goals. It also offers economic benefits to operators, such as through the federal 45Q tax credit for sequestering CO2, along with various state or financial incentives. It also generates jobs that can benefit local communities. The U.S. offers diverse geology, and a variety of formations are potential storage units, so opportunities exist nationwide to participate in commercial-scale CCUS. Significant research into CCUS has demonstrated the viability of sequestration technologies in various geologic scenarios. The maturity of CCUS technologies, increased focus on climate change objectives to reduce CO2 emissions, and economic incentives will likely result in an increase in the number of CCUS projects over the next several years. The need for regulatory certainty. In addition to selecting sites with adequate geologic conditions, prospective CCUS project operators will need to consider and understand the permitting requirements and other regulatory nuances for the breadth of activities involved in siting and initiating a CCUS project. In addition to federal requirements, individual states have unique and specific laws, regulations, and policies, many of which are ingrained in long-standing legal frameworks such as those associated with oil and gas or mineral exploration. Large-scale deployment of CCUS technology will benefit from a strong regulatory regime that is informed by science and experience, and that provides the regulatory certainty that all players need before embarking on projects of the anticipated scale of a commercial CCUS project. Our research. Our organization prepared a report that evaluates how 10 states address policy issues relevant to the transportation and storage components of CCUS. We started out by looking at what we call the physical landscape of each state as it relates to CCUS, including where oil and gas exploration is occurring and where CO2 sources are located. We also looked for information on current and planned CO2 pipeline infrastructure. In addition, we researched CO2 geologic storage potential in the states, including promising storage formations, and examined relevant research into CO2 transport or storage underway, as well as any pilot and commercial scale projects. We then examined the regulatory landscape associated with CCUS-related activities, including regulations for pipeline transport, geologic storage, and production and injection activities. We also looked at other environmental requirements that may be applicable to CCUS operations, such as rules for groundwater and surface water protection, air quality, and induced seismicity. And we looked for regulations related to the siting of enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, facilities or pipelines, and the state's use and interpretation of eminent domain authority, particularly as it relates to CCUS-related activities. We then described the state's approach to assigning mineral rights and determining ownership, the treatment of surface versus mineral estates, and how pore space ownership is determined. Of course, it's important to note that this is a high-level study that is a snapshot in time as of the report's publication in October 2021, and due diligence for any prospective CCUS project necessitates a thorough review of applicable laws and regulations. So the 10 states reviewed, the body of the report describes each of the 10 states we studied. In the interest of time, I won't go into each of them, but I do want to introduce the states, which are shown on the slide, and their physical aspects related to CCUS. Several of these states are situated over large geologic formations that are suitable to receive significant quantities of CO2. For example, large saline formations such as the Mount Simon Sandstone in Indiana and Michigan, and the Arbuckle Group of Kansas, and saline formations of Louisiana, Mississippi, Nebraska, and Utah offer significant storage capacity. several states have a long history of oil and gas exploration and existing infrastructure in oil fields, such as in Alabama, California, Kansas, Michigan, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. Coal beds such as the Black Warrior Basin in Alabama and coal beds in Mississippi and Indiana also offer storage potential. Some of these states have existing CO2 pipeline infrastructure. For example, a network of CO2 pipelines runs from Mississippi into the neighboring states. Oklahoma also has a network of CO2 pipelines, and CO2 pipelines exist within the Rocky Mountain region in Utah. The CO2 sources reflect the economies of these states and include energy and electricity generation for all. Other states are dominated by the agricultural-related sources, such as ethanol refineries. Still others are dominated by industrial processes, such as chemical or steel manufacturing and cement kilns. As I mentioned earlier, selecting and securing a CCUS site involves numerous technical and policy considerations, such as those that I have listed right now on the slide. I'd now like to share our findings and how the states we studied compare in these areas. So first, I'm going to talk about CO2 geologic storage potential. Of course, the availability of subsurface space to store large volumes of CO2 is a primary consideration for the success of a commercial scale CCUS project. In particular, if the CO2 is to be injected for long-term storage, the storage formation would have to at least meet the requirements in the federal Class 6 rule, which require an extensive storage formation with at least enough storage or pore space to contain the volumes of CO2 proposed to be stored, and that is overlain by a competent confining zone. As the graphic here shows, saline formations do exist throughout the US, with some significant ones in the states we studied. And as I mentioned, several states have existing infrastructure in EOR fields or coal beds that also offer storage potential. CCUS activities in the states we studied ranged from feasibility studies of the life cycle of CCUS projects to pilot studies and demonstration projects to pending applications for full-scale projects under review in California and Indiana. CO2 pipeline infrastructure and capacity. Optimally, storage reservoirs would be located near CO2 emission sources or near existing CO2 pipelines or roads capable of carrying truck traffic. This source sink material matching is critical because limiting distances over which CO2 must be transported can reduce transportation costs and risks, and increase the profitability of a CCUS project. Louisiana, for example, is looking to capitalize on the co-location of refineries and CO2 sinks in the state's industrial corridor, which may limit the need for an extensive CO2 pipeline build-out. However, the geologic sink does not always underlie the source of CO2, necessitating the use of pipelines as a means of transportation. While some states have extensive natural gas transmission pipelines, they currently have varying levels of CO2 pipeline infrastructure. Some states such as Alabama, California, Indiana, and Nebraska have non-existent or limited infrastructure, while states such as Michigan, Mississippi, and Oklahoma have small to extensive CO2 ER infrastructure and CO2 emission pipelines. The current lack of CO2 pipeline infrastructure in many states means that significant CO2 pipeline construction would need to occur to help make large-scale CCUS commercially attractive. Research to expand pipeline capacity is underway, though. For example, a 1,200-mile conceptual pipeline would connect CO2 sources and sinks across Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, and Illinois. Utah has also focused CCUS research initiatives on areas with existing pipeline networks, and Kansas is currently studying the potential for a large cross-state CO2 pipeline that connects energy production areas to oil fields. Repurposing natural gas pipelines for CO2 transportation would also be a significant undertaking. While they're both gases, they will behave differently at supercritical conditions, forcing the pipeline to meet various operation criteria such as pressure, temperature, and diameter. Now we're going to transition a little and talk about the regulatory landscape. So first, I'm going to talk about CO2 storage acts. All of the states we studied are recognizing the value of CCUS as a burgeoning technology and an economic opportunity. They're beginning to pass laws or identify policy mechanisms to address CCUS and related activities. Several states have passed some form of a carbon storage act to generally assert the state's intent to address and provide regulatory certainty for CCUS project operators, with the goal of facilitating commercial scale investment in CCUS. These acts help set a regulatory framework, offer incentives, and provide policy clarity for how CCUS operations are addressed, either via new regulations or within existing regulatory schemes. Some of these acts, for example, in Louisiana and Mississippi, provide financial incentives in the form of CO2 storage funds or assumption of post-closure liability that provides financial certainty over the long term to prospective operators. Indiana and Oklahoma statutorily describe how CCUS fits into existing regulatory frameworks, such as eminent domain or field unitization. Many of these acts authorize the development of rules for CO2 injection for storage. Louisiana and Mississippi's acts express the state's intent to apply for Class 6 primacy. Louisiana and Alabama have also developed draft rules for CO2 injection for storage. Michigan and California have not passed the CO2 Storage Act at the time of our report, although they do express goals for reducing carbon pollution and economic decarbonization through executive orders or other means. States are beginning to address CO2 as a taxable commodity that is tied to a use they consider to be beneficial to their citizens and recognize the economic benefits of CCUS. Most of the states apply a severance or other tax to use of CO2 in oil field operations. However, a few states reduce that tax or offer credits if the CO2 is to be sequestered. Pipeline design, construction, operation, and maintenance are regulated at the state level and typically mirror the minimum federal safety standards. All of the states we studied regulate oil or natural gas pipelines. However, the states are in varying stages of developing and regulating CO2 pipelines. Louisiana, Michigan, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Utah are the only states presented in this research in which CO2 pipelines or CO2 transport are directly addressed in regulations. Louisiana and Oklahoma regulate CO2 pipelines, and Mississippi requires that transportation of CO2 comply with U.S. Department of Transportation requirements. Mississippi gives each county's Board of Supervisors authority to regulate the construction and maintenance of CO2 pipelines locally. In Utah, CO2 captured and transported for sequestration is exempt from classification as a hazardous waste if the CO2 generator and the well operator certify that the CO2 stream has not been mixed with hazardous wastes and is transported in compliance with U.S. Department of Transportation requirements. Alabama, California, Indiana, Kansas, and Nebraska did not have requirements specific to CO2 pipelines at the time of our report. All of the states we studied have existing and mature oil and gas permitting programs. Where EOR is already in play, particularly in depleting oil and gas-bearing formations, transitioning to using the fields for CO2 storage may be financially advantageous. For example, if surface facilities that support injection operations are in place, the operations and the wells could be adapted to allow transitioning the wells for CO2 storage and meet the Class 6 CO2 injection requirements. Operators planning for CCUS in existing oil and gas fields would need to consider and adapt to existing siting, spacing, and unitization requirements for a field. Most of the states we study have minimum requirements for well spacing within a field, setting minimum distances of several hundred feet from other producing wells or field boundaries. States may also have provisions for unitization of fields or pools to facilitate exploration or optimize the location of wells. CCUS project operators would need to be mindful of these requirements, particularly where an expanding CO2 plume could affect other nearby subsurface operations. Different requirements apply to injection operations depending on whether the injection of CO2 is for long-term geologic storage, which would be a Class 6 injection well, or as part of an oil and gas recovery operation, which is Class 2. All of the states studied, except for Michigan, have Class 2 primacy under Section 1425 of the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. These states all have similar requirements for Class 2 wells. Class 2 well operators must obtain a permit and meet minimum standards to ensure that injection activities, including those that involve injecting CO2 for EOR, do not endanger underground sources of drinking water or USDWs. In all of the states with primacy, the same state organization oversees injection and production wells. Operators seeking to convert Class 2 wells for geologic sequestration would need to be aware of any differing requirements that, once converted, the well meets the Class 6 well construction requirements, particularly for depth of surface casing, cementing, and the use of corrosion-resistant materials. Currently, only 2 states nationwide have primacy for Class 6, and none of the states we studied have it at this point. Although, as I mentioned earlier, a few of our states expressed interest in developing Class 6 rules or applying for primacy. But at this point, any permits for CO2 injection for geologic storage would be issued by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Environmental laws and regulations. In addition to production and injection related requirements, prospective CCUS project operators would need to meet a variety of other environmental regulations. These other environmental considerations include how a state defines USDWs or fresh water for injection and production well construction purposes. And in all of the states we studied, injection and production wells must be constructed to protect the deepest USDW or fresh water layer. All of the states define USDWs for injection well construction the same as the federal definition of 10,000 milligrams per liter of total dissolved solids, or TDS. Most states' production well regulations mirror this definition, with the exception of California, which defines fresh water as containing 3,000 milligrams per liter of TDS or less, and Mississippi, where the oil and gas regulations do not designate a threshold. This consistency can be important, as the cost and time associated with retrofitting the surface casing and cement of a well that was cemented to an inadequate depth would be significant. Where injection-induced seismicity is a concern, states may have requirements or guidelines that apply to injection operations. The risk of injection-induced seismicity is typically evaluated in Class 6 permits, as seismic information is required as part of a Class 6 permit application. Kansas and Oklahoma have developed risk-based seismic characterization and response plans for injection projects that are based on the magnitude and the frequency of seismic events. And Nebraska requires a seismic risk assessment as part of the CCUS permitting process. Also, air quality regulations, especially related to CO2 or methane releases, would need to be considered by prospective operators. States' air quality regulations typically mirror the federal standards, but some states such as California, Kansas, Louisiana, Indiana, and Michigan have recognized CO2 as a contaminant or have standards specific to CO2 emissions by virtue of including or not excluding CO2 in their broad definitions of an air pollutant. Water rights and the prioritization of groundwater and surface water uses are also essential for site selection and the use of this natural resource. We reviewed water rights as they govern both surface water and groundwater uses. Alabama, Indiana, Louisiana, and Mississippi adhere to a riparian rights system in which rights are granted to landowners through which a natural surface water body runs. Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Utah honor an appropriative rights system where authority to use water is granted by the state via a permit. California and Michigan observe both systems, and priority is dependent on the water source and use. In some cases, like California, riparian rights will supersede appropriative rights, and priority is based on the date of permit application. Most states will have an order of preference for usage by type, such as industrial, agricultural, or municipal uses. They may also set maximum withdrawal limits based on stream flow. However, some states like Oklahoma may not honor a prioritization, and several states may also restrict water usage during emergencies, which is a potential concern as drought issues become more common. Eminent domain. Many states allow the taking of private property by eminent domain for activities that are considered to be a public use for the common good, if proper procedures are followed and fair compensation is made. All of the states we studied authorize eminent domain and have procedures for condemnation. These procedures are specified by regulation and are typically conducted via the courts, with evaluation of the taken property determined by a judge or jury. Generally, eminent domain applies to oil and gas field development, such as pipelines, underground storage, and surface operations. However, we found limited coverage and application of eminent domain specific to CO2 transportation or storage. At the time of the research for our report, Indiana, Louisiana, Michigan, and Mississippi had regulatory language regarding eminent domain as it relates to CO2 pipelines. It is possible that CO2 pipelines, particularly those that are used to transport CO2 for EOR, would be considered common carriers and satisfy the public use requirement to allow for eminent domain. Louisiana also specifies that property can also be taken for the underground storage of CO2. Many states define a mineral as oil, natural gas, or any substance that occurs naturally in the subsurface. However, CO2 may or may not be explicitly included in the state's definition of a mineral, which causes ambiguity. States also vary regarding whether subsurface or surface rights dominate when multiple users are planned. For the majority of states, it is unclear if CCUS operators would need to own the surface rights, mineral rights, pore space, or a combination of these. However, a few states specifically addressed ownership of stored CO2. In Louisiana and Mississippi, the ownership of CO2 does not change when it is injected. In Nebraska, ownership of CO2 is transferred from the state to the state upon site project closure, after which the state assumes responsibility for long-term monitoring and liability. Most states allow the ability to sever mineral rights from the surface estate, resulting in a split estate. And in most cases of a split estate, the mineral estate is dominant. The exception is Louisiana, where landowners may still convey or lease the right to explore and develop their land for mineral production. The owner of the mineral rights will typically have access to the surface estate to extract the minerals so long as the surface owner is compensated. However, a few states restrict this right of access. For example, in Oklahoma, operators must pay surface damages resulting from their operations, and Utah requires users to minimize interference with the surface owner's use of their land. Some states, such as Kansas, does not establish mineral dominance, but still provide an implied right to using the surface in order to develop the land. Additionally, many states have dormant mineral rights clauses, meaning if the title to minerals is not used for a given period of time, such as after 10 years of inactivity, the mineral rights will revert back to the surface owner. Pore space includes all subsurface space that is devoid of minerals and generally belongs to the surface owner. The majority of states we studied do not explicitly discuss pore space ownership or the implied rights of the mineral or surface owner to that space. This may mean that an operator who is interested in acquiring pore space rights for CCUS may need to negotiate with both the surface and mineral estates owners to obtain subsurface pore space. A couple of states have addressed pore space ownership as it relates to CO2 storage. Mississippi, for example, requires CO2 geologic sequestration facility operators to obtain approval from the majority interest of surface and subsurface owners. And in Nebraska, the title to any subsurface reservoir is owned by the surface owner unless it was previously severed. Due to the lack of explicit statute, the majority of the state's legal language regarding CCUS in the context of subsurface rights is largely interpretive and based on historic legal proceedings. This is the case, for example, in Kansas, Louisiana, and Michigan. In conclusion, the interest in CCUS is increasing as states set decarbonization goals and with financial incentives such as tax credits. Suitable geologic formations to store CO2 exist throughout the US, and opportunities exist nationwide to participate in commercial scale CCUS. Matching of CO2 sources with geologic sinks is a critical element to reduce risk and cost. But either lacking or limited CO2 pipeline infrastructure in many states means that significant CO2 pipeline construction would need to occur to make CCUS commercially attractive for stakeholders. There is a need for regulatory certainty across all the policy areas, but there are gaps in the regulatory completeness of some states. Some states have not yet addressed how CCUS operators may fit into certain elements of their regulatory structures, such as for CO2 pipelines, eminent domain, pore space, or ownership of the CO2. Filling these gaps would provide the certainty needed to enable investment. Increasing focus on CO2 storage acts that specifically address CCUS in the state or allow it to fit into existing schemes, as well as providing financial incentives, will further the implementation of CCUS. These acts also reflect the state's commitment to decarbonization and associated technologies such as CCUS, which incentivizes implementation. We hope that studies such as ours help states identify where the regulatory gaps may exist to focus CO2 storage acts or clarify existing frameworks to address the needs of CCUS operators to facilitate further inclusion of this important tool for meeting decarbonization goals. And then, as always, thank you to USDA for the research opportunity, to my Cadmus co-authors, my wonderful technical director, Sherry, and thank you to all of you for listening. And with that, I think we can turn to questions.
Yeah, it looks like we've got a couple coming in. And Marie, thank you very much. And if anybody thought doing CCS was going to be simple and easy, just pick up a couple of the studies and understand a lot of homework when you go to the subsurface part. One of the first questions that we have, and I think, Sherry, I'll direct this towards you. Ilya Krupanik at the California Energy Commission is asking, do you think CO2 pipeline projects are realistic in California with the current state of regulations? If not, what needs to be done?
Thanks, Mike. And I think the second question actually there was kind of a follow-up to California. So maybe we can talk about both. At the time of our research, California, I believe, did not have any regulations related to pipelines, which obviously would introduce some ambiguity. I think a lot of the CCUS activity in California is around the oil fields, which may reduce the amount of pipeline that would be needed, or make truck transport a little more of a realistic option for for perhaps what might be shorter distances. And then regarding this new bill, that did postdate our research, and so can't really speak too much about it. California is certainly one of those states that has, as you can guess, for California, probably one of the biggest sets of regulations, so that probably will expand the amount of compliance that needs to be paid attention to.
Jesse, did you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, I'll just chime in on the pipeline question generally. I think, well, I just published the law review article entitled "How Environmental Litigation Has Turned Pipelines into Pipe Dreams." And it reviews a lot of the recent litigation involving pipelines. I think it's almost impossible to build a pipeline anywhere in the United States right now. And I think some groups are starting to rethink their opposition to all pipelines, because they are now realizing that, well, if we don't have pipelines, we can't do CCUS. But as most of you probably know, Senator Manchin from West Virginia attempted to include provisions in the resolution, the budget resolution, that would ease some of the permitting regulations for pipelines and other infrastructure. That had to be pulled because there was too much opposition to it. I think something needs to happen where we're not going to build any more pipelines. I just don't see it happening.
It's an effect that the power transmission line people have run into as well. So that leads me to with your comment there, that leads me to a question of if I am a midstream operator, for example, and I'm in traditional oil and gas, maybe gas liquids and what have you, I'm going to have a lot of right-of-ways for the different systems that come into me and to the different places I deliver what I've gathered and as a midstream person send out to customers or storage or for export, what have you. How hard is it to repurpose right-of-ways? Older right-of-ways are probably more ambiguous than the newer ones that are probably specific, maybe similar to newer mineral leases that are very specific to what you've got, how deep, what formation, whereas older ones were kind of from the surface to China. But thinking about that, well, we do have a lot of this infrastructure in place. Of course, it depends on each state. How hard or how critical could that be? And I'm going to take that to you first, Jess, and Sherry, I'll bring it back to you. And then we've got a question from Jeffrey Mulse we'll get to as well.
Well, I have to give the lawyer's typical answer to any question for that one. It depends.
Sure.
And it's going to really depend on the particular language of each right-of-way agreement. It's certainly easier to repurpose a right-of-way than it is an existing pipeline. So I think you're right, though. The older ones are pretty ambiguous, and you can probably fit CO2 pipelines into a lot of them. The more recent ones, the language is probably more precise, and it may be more difficult. But I think that's another area where we just really don't know until we're able to review some of the language and kind of take an inventory of what's out there.
And Sherry, what's your feeling on that?
I would probably agree. I think probably, like Jesse mentioned, a lot of these are really old and probably nobody had reason to test them, but there may be a challenge the first time it's done, or the first time that there's a need to oppose, a feeling in the community to oppose a project in general.
I've got from Jeffrey Amels. The last I saw, there were planned pipelines to take about 15% of the CO2 from bioethanol plants in the Midwest, not 100% to North Dakota. That data may not be current. What is the capacity of pipeline projects that you know about? And Sherry?
Oh, that's tough. The specific capacity, that's going to slip my brain this morning, but we did see in our research that there was a need across several of the states in the Midwest, and I think it ran all the way over to North Dakota, and a need to connect all of the field, the huge saline formations that exist with the ethanol facilities. There's Marie spoke about that source sink matching that's so important, and there's a lot of sources right there with the bioethanol, and then some fantastically suitable formations such as the Mount Simon that probably make the pipeline investment worth it, especially as the value of the 45Q tax credit has increased. It probably makes the equation there even more palatable.
Yep.
With the specific capacity, I'm sorry, that just slips my.
No, that's okay. I think there's a couple of them that we know a lot about in the public domain. There's a handful out there that aren't so public. There's going to be a lot more surface over the next 6 months, I figure. Jesse, how about you on that? Any insights to that as well, or?
I guess I'll give the lawyer's second favorite answer. I don't know. I mean, I just really don't have a good handle on that, and I'm not aware of the data on that.
Yeah, I think that there's, like I said, I think there's 3 heading towards North Dakota or nearby, and there's some of that information is in the public domain, kind of a broad, general sense that I think that Jeffrey might be able to find. The next question is: does federalization of pipelines, i.e., the FERC, solve some of the construction issues raised? And before you answer that, personal experience, we tapped into this space about 10 years ago, and it was a group, and the idea was that response, well, that's simple. Just add 3 words to the Natural Gas Act and carbon dioxide. But at that time, the gas world wasn't really excited about being associated with the CO2 world. But anyway, I'll take to you on that about federalization, Jesse.
Yeah, the latest case law, and I'm seeing messages that there are some pipelines being built in North Dakota and in the Midwest. There's also been some fierce opposition to some of the pipelines proposed, and I'm blanking out, but it was the one who went through some Native American country that got a lot of opposition. But the cases, most of them involve FERC, and it hasn't seemed to help because the processes of FERC and other government agencies are being challenged. Now, part of this is the fact that under the Trump administration, these federal agencies took a certain approach to approving pipelines and other infrastructure. When President Biden took office, his administration changed that approach, just as President Trump's administration changed the approach of President Obama. So some of these cases have actually turned on the fact that the Obama administration had proceeded down the road quite a way. Then President Trump was elected and took a really quick 360. And the court said, whoa, wait a minute. How did you come up with such a different conclusion so quickly? So I think there could be some improvements through federalization, but it all comes down in a lot of cases to process, and the process needs to be followed. And if you make a mistake, there's going to be a challenge.
Sherry, or even Marie, any insights on that from your side?
I don't have anything to add on that. I guess as a geologist, I'll say that our favorite answer about things above the surface is I don't know.
All right. So again, in another angle, Illinois was in one of the studies but I wanted to highlight, I was around the natural gas storage business for a while, and amongst hats I've had, and natural gas had been stored in Illinois for close to 100 years. And I never read anything where they had any issues with the pore space rights for storing natural gas in the state of Illinois for the last 100 years, and it seemed to work pretty good. Did I miss something in that process, and why maybe it's not applicable to CO2? Jesse, I'll start with you on that one.
I think Illinois actually has a pretty clear framework on that, and they stand out as one of the states that is ahead of the curve. Whereas in many states, like West Virginia until recently, Pennsylvania still, and other states, there are maybe conflicting cases, and we don't know, and there's no statutory provision. As Tara said, I think the presumption is that the surface owner owns the pore space. But that's not clear in a lot of states. I think Illinois is the exception rather than the rule.
And Sherry, that was in one of your reports. And so what was your take on that?
Was Illinois one of ours?
Was Illinois, or is that in?
It was one of ours.
It was yours. All right. Sorry about that, Sherry. We covered a lot of ground in those two reports. There is a lot of talk out there now about the dissolved minerals in the produced water. And I think we tried to touch base on that in the reports and wade into that space. And so you have, we'll take the Permian Basin. You've got 5 million barrels a day of production of crude oil, probably close to 25 million barrels a day of produced water that's being re-injected 24 hours a day. And it is a waste product. It is a disposed water issue, but it would sure complicate things if there was a lot of dissolved minerals in it and it had a value to the mineral holder of the land. Is that surfacing in other states? I think like Wyoming's has a fairly well identified lithium volume in its produced waters now. Will that become an issue with the landowner or the mineral holder if you refuse to process out the lithium and just inject it as a waste of the water? I'm all over the map on that a little bit, but that's been in a couple of different discussions I've been in lately.
I'm not sure that anybody has any control over a specific content of the waste. I don't know that lithium is a hazardous component, so it's not going to raise anything there. Probably some of the states, I know I think Utah and California were the only states that we looked at that even address lithium and not directly related to injection activities. But whether it probably is going to have to do with more of an economics of, when does it become financially beneficial to invest in extracting the lithium, because it's such it is such an important rare earth for this battery technology. Presumably, as the greater number of incentives come up to come up with ways to pull away from fossil fuels, obviously battery technology is it, and whether the degree to which operators or entities and technology are willing to go to extract small amounts of lithium from the produced water, right?
Mm-hmm. And Jesse, your thoughts on that, or Marie?
I haven't seen much on lithium.
Right.
And on our part of the study, for our states, lithium really didn't seem to be bubbling up to the surface at all.
So another one that kind of will fall back into the states areas. So we've got a lot of produced water as we do oil and gas production, but we're going to see more than likely a lot of produced water as these large brine sites become injection sites for CO2. These reservoirs are at a certain stasis already. Any injected volumes into there's going to be some kind of displacement to keep from overpressurizing these areas. It may not happen in the beginning, but it will inevitably take place. So the water that gets produced from CO2 storage could be to produce some CO2 storage will be the same, have the same criteria about how to handle it as a waste. But what if the technologies, and this is a what if, so it's, we go a lot of places with what ifs, but the technologies for cleaning up water in the produced water area from the shale production areas, for example, have seen some huge improvements in the efficiencies and the cost of cleaning water up for reintroduction, the stream replenishment, maybe even enough for potable water. Will that become a commodity rather than a waste issue? And do you need to kind of paper your bases up in advance? Because once you start doing the CO2 storage process, you're kind of in it for a long time, and rules and regulations can change over time. Do you see water becoming that kind of an issue in the future? Jesse?
Go ahead, Sherry.
No, I was just going to say, if lithium is if lithium pulled out of the produced substances is something that's an important quantity, I think water is even more so, and it's probably going to be, again, if the water is genuinely just saline, there may be areas of the country, particularly out west, where people need to drink, and it may come to that. Drought, as Marie alluded, there are areas where drought is a big concern, and it relates to water rights. I think a lot of times, as far as the presence of the water in the subsurface, it is accounted for in the computational modeling that's done to determine, that the front of the CO2 and that pressure front ahead of it. And I think it's accounted for in there. So I'm not sure that it's always produced, but it would also be, that could be a way to mitigate the size of that area review if you did produce. So yeah, I think it could end up being a commodity it could end up being something that is worth saving and treating and drinking.
It's a hot issue in water rights right now. There's a recent case in Texas, and the question now, it was a waste product. Now I think it's a commodity. And so that, of course, begs the question, who owns it? And there are some fights going on who owns the wastewater. Does the surface owner, does the mineral owner, who owns that? And there's a case that was just put up on appeal in Texas discussing that, and it's an issue that we've started to look at. And again, most state statutes don't address it. So at this point, it's going to be what the courts decide after you battle it out in court.
Yeah. So I got a question that just popped up. How much do we need to worry about earthquakes and associated liability? And just as a area of experience, we do a CO2 conference out in Midland every year in December. And last December, Mark Sobak and from Stanford and others were flagging that there was a lot of deep water injections taking place, not the typical wastewater injections at the shallower depths. And they were warning that they're liable to trigger some stronger seismic responses. And 3 weeks after that, and he even said up around Big Springs, Texas, you might expect, because of the volumes that are being pushed down below. And sure enough, there's about a 4.5 point Richter scale earthquake that took place there. And there's been a handful of them down on the New Mexico Texas border as well. So there's definite response to seismicity, or there's definite seismicity response to injected water. How do you answer a question like this, and how much do we need to worry about earthquakes and associated liability? Jesse?
I'll defer to Sherry on that if she has opinions on that. I know that some states have passed statutes limiting underground injection to prevent that. But Sherry might have some insights.
I think so. Seismicity is definitely associated with and the criteria are going to slip my mind right now, but pretty much the presence of a capable fault And typically, what typically happens is where there's proximity to that crystalline basement, you know, not the porous sandstones or saline formations that are being tapped as CO2 storage facilities, but that more you know, solid hard rock that wouldn't absorb the water. And I think many of the large formations, for instance, the Mount Simon, are significantly above the crystalline basement, where the potential for the seismicity is not as great. So that wastewater injection scenario that caused so much ado about 7 or 8 years ago may not come into play in these situations. But also, several states do have, several states that we studied at least, include some type of a seismic response. A seismic consideration for either injection operations as a whole or CCUS operations, to understand it, to study it, to build into emergency and remedial response plans that are required, at least under the federal Class 6 regulations, and therefore by any states with primacy. I think seismic. Dealing with a seismic event is part of that, and both for damage to anything on the surface as well as the potential damage to the integrity of the well.
Jesse?
I don't have anything to add to that.
I understand. So we can put CO2 down in the ground in brine or depleted oil and gas reservoirs. We've got the pore space issues. But how about a salt cavern? It's just one big old pore space, technically. What happens when we do CO2 storage with salt? I think the state of Louisiana isn't a big fan of that, but other states are exploring that now.
I have yet to run into an example. See anything? I know that they are potential spaces. Like, you're right, they are a big space in the middle. And they have been contemplated as an example. I'm not sure that there's even been any research, at the DOE R&D level on that.
We have a lot of analogs, but not CO2.
Yes.
Know anything on that one, Jesse?
No, I think it's going to be have to look to further research on that.
All right. I got another one just out of left field as I'm watching here. Wait 1 second. Make sure I get everybody's questions that come in here. I'm looking at the we can randomly speculate potential hazards and the related lawyers delights litigation all day long, but labs like PNNL, Pacific Northwest Labs, national labs, are deeply involved in developing the computer models to predict CO2 geologic plume space behavior. And that's a good shout out for the labs work. And there's been a lot of this going on for a long time. These are not new issues. And out of all fairness to that, and the DOE and states governments have all put a lot of money, and private interests have put a lot of money into understanding these things. And there's a lot more knowledge on the street about this than was before. The one other question: does a particular pipeline have a certain subordinating right over other pipelines when it comes to right-of-ways? So if it's deemed that hydrogen is like a critical national security commodity or process, can a hydrogen pipeline subordinate a natural gas or a crude or a gasoline or a CO2 pipeline for very scarce right-of-way areas? Could you conceive that ever happening?
I think it would depend on the right-of-way agreement.
Right.
And if the federal government wants to prioritize certain types of pipelines, I would think that they would have to compensate the landowner to do that if there's any damage to the landowner there.
Sherry, any feel for that?
No, nothing to add. I think it's a step beyond the question about natural gas to CO2 pipelines, hydrogen.
So one other one here, and I don't know, maybe you've got some you might want to throw out for answers as well. So if I install wind towers in particular areas, I have a landowner, I own the air shed to a certain altitude. That's air I get compensated for the energy that the towers derive out of it. And as the CO2 space continues to, the removal area continues to expand, and you begin implementing $185, $180 45Q tax credit, and you're doing direct air capture, does CO2 become a valuable proposition for a landowner in the airshed that it owns that the CO2 is being removed from? So you assume that you own it, it's your CO2 to remove, or is it somebody else's? Or if you, I don't mean to be frivolous with this, but if you remove too much, do you diminish the value of your neighbor? Unlike like drawing water rights, oil and gas rights. And alternatively, if you've got a wind farm, your turbulence from wind towers do impact the air shed of your neighbors and their ability to also extract wind energy out of their air shed. Just crazy thoughts, but these things come up in unique conversations. These have just recently popped up. And as a result of the direct air capture efforts underway right now and the high tax credit that's there.
I think those are good questions, and I think I had some discussions recently. Everything seems to come back to nuisance, which is that you have the right, when you own property, you own it from the center of the earth to the heavens.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't use your property to interfere with your neighbor's reasonable use of the property. And some wind turbine projects have been challenged on a nuisance basis. I think the carbon that's in the air above your property, it's already becoming a commodity that landowners probably rightfully are going to try to take advantage of. And I think if it gets to the point that Mike is talking about, that removing carbon from the air above my property interferes with what my neighbor can do with their property. And I know Ann from DC is, like a lot of us, not a big fan of litigation. I'm not a big fan of litigation either, but unless we have some legislative frameworks, it's going to default to litigation to see who's right trumps who and where we draw the line. And that's kind of related to the one question we had, that how much would Western water rights affect removal of produced water? And that's a great question, because in the West, it's prior appropriation. And so if you don't have a senior water right, you can't take any water. And that's one of the questions that we're grappling with, is because produced water is becoming more valuable, where does it fit into the prior appropriation scheme? And I think that can be a barrier or a constraint on removal.
Thank you on that one, Jess. Do you want anything to add there, Sherry, on your side with your insights?
No, not really. That's a I think we found that states generally hadn't addressed who owns CO2 and pore space, but this is
it's all kind of wrapped into the same thing about rights and issues around the topic of CO2 and the other things that move around it. I think that we have Jeffrey Almails has given a comment in here, and I would say, well, I'll read it since he took the time to write it. CO2 sequestration is not only going to be needed for CO2 from bioethanol, low-hanging fruit, but also steam reforming of natural gas, SMR, to make hydrogen, and from existing large industrial furnaces. For example, those associated with natural gas, coal-fired power plants for H2 or hydrogen. We need to not only add CO2 recovery to new projects, but retrofit the 90 metric ton a year of existing capacity. So that's more of a comment from him, but I thought I'd put it out since he took the time to write it. I believe, and Jen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we're probably up against our timeline here for the day. And Simon as well. Is there? We're done, I believe, and I want to thank everybody who sat through the panel, endured some of my questions, and thank you to the audience that put their questions to us. Both groups did a phenomenal job putting these packages together, the study reports. There's been a couple of questions about the titles for the reports. Somebody can get back with both of them to the person asked the question, and they are available in the market space. They're actually, you can find them on the USCA website. They're in our archives, and they're free to be downloaded. Take the time to track them down on our website. And with that, I am done. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thanks to you. Yeah, thanks to you, Mike.
Thank
Thanks
you.
to all of our moderators and panelists across the 2 days of the conference. My name is Simon Nicholson. I'm with the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy at American University. I have the privilege now of wrapping us up, acknowledging the support of the Program of Environmental Policy and Culture at Northwestern University and the Pritzker School of Law at Northwestern for their co-sponsorship of this event. Again, I'm with the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy. The videos from these sessions will be posted at our website, carbonremoval.info, within the next couple of weeks. It's been a great couple of days. Thank you all. See you at another event very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.